And there's a thumbs up. Well, I'm going to start with a refrain that I've offered a few times today, which is that I'm nearly certain that our guest brought the good weather from Los Angeles. Michael's getting tired of this one, but I'm going to hold him to it for his next visit. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Josh Owen. I am the Vignelli Distinguished Professor of Design and the Director of the Vignelli Center for Design Studies. This afternoon marks the 5th lecture of the 21-22 academic year and the second of our Spring 22 Vignelli Design Conversations series presented by Design Milk and RIT's Magic Center, made possible in part by the generosity of RIT alumnus Chris Bailey and Bailey Brand Consulting. I'd like to begin by offering a special thanks to President Munson, Provost Granberg, and Dr. Waters for their collective support for design and the built environment at RIT, and also for their enthusiasm for sharing tonight's guest with our lecture series. I'd also like to thank Jim Yarrington and RIT's Planning and Design Services team, as well as Dennis and Draco and our architecture program, who have helped make this afternoon's lecture the first in a series of 3 talks that will address the next 50 years of the RIT campus. Please look for details on all of our next speakers by joining our mailing list on the Vignelli Center website and following us on social channels. I'd like to thank our interpreters for this afternoon, Sarah Brewer and Amber Lee Jones, for their work. Because our presentation today is occurring in person and via Zoom concurrently, I will be rotating between questions from our live audience and our online participants during the Q&A segment after the lecture. Rochester Institute of Technology's Vignelli Center for Design Studies is an international hub for education, research, collaboration, and advocacy, which expands the scope of the programs in the College of Art and Design School of Design. The facility houses the archive of renowned designers Lella and Massimo Vignelli, whose works are icons of international design. The center and archives sit within RIT's College of Art and Design, which was built on the traditional territory of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as Seneca people, the keepers of the Western Door. They are one of the 6 sovereign nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We honor the land on which RIT was built and recognize the unique relationship that the indigenous stewards have with this land. That relationship is the core of their traditions, cultures, and histories. We recognize the history of genocide, colonization, and assimilation of these indigenous peoples that took place on this land. Mindful of these histories, we work towards understanding, acknowledging, and reconciling. As stewards of history and content, we must acknowledge and seek to learn from our context, bad and good, ugly and beautiful. This applies to the Vignelli Center as with any archive. The Vignellis taught us that design is a systematic framework for solving the world's most intractable problems. If recent times have taught us anything, it's that while we as humans are adaptable, our societies and systems have significant flaws. We're at a point when we need to have difficult discussions and work to create a new balance in the world. In this, design must play a critical role. As the director, I aim to make the Vignelli Center even more accessible and applicable by bringing in stimulating guest contributors from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds who help us to consider design in innovative ways. The Vignelli's design is one philosophy leaves us with a universal message that design is a lens through which we can envision a more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. This afternoon, we're delighted to welcome Michael Maltzan to the podium. Michael founded Michael Maltzan Architecture Incorporated in 1995. His projects cross a wide range of typologies from cultural institutions to city infrastructure. Michael's notable projects include the Moody Center for the Arts at Rice University, MoMA Queens, Star Apartments, the Pittman Dowell Residence, the new 6th Street Viaduct, MIT Vassar Street Residential Hall, and the Winnipeg Art Gallery Inuit Art Center. Michael received an M.Arch from the Graduate School of Design, Harvard University, and a BFA and B.Arch degrees from the Rhode Island School of Design. He is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and received the 2016 AIA Los Angeles Gold Medal. He is a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award and was elected to the National Academy of Design in 2020. In 2021, the Society of Architectural Historians presented him with its Change Agent Award. He currently serves on the Dean's Leadership Council at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and the Visiting Committee to the GSD. He was featured in the Canadian Center for Architecture's 2019 film, What It Takes to Make a Home, delivered to the 20th Annual John T. Dunlap Lecture for the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University, and his work was named one of the 25 Best Inventions of 2015 by Time magazine. Michael Maltzan's work has gained international acclaim for innovation in both design and construction. It has been recognized with 5 Progressive Architecture Awards, 47 citations from local, state, and national chapters of the American Institute of Architects, the Rudy Bruner Foundation's Gold Medal for Urban Excellence, the Zimbotel Group Award for Innovations for Sustainability and Humanity in the Built Environment, and a 2020 Best of the Millennium AIA LA Honor Award. The firm and its projects have been widely featured in national and international publications and have been exhibited in museums worldwide, including the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, Museum of Modern Art New York, the Heinz Architectural Center, the Canadian Center for Architecture, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. The firm's work was selected for the 2006, 2018, and 2020 Biennale di Venezia. 12 years ago, Lela and Massimo Vignelli completed a building on the RIT campus which acts as a global beacon for design, and that has forever enhanced our narrative and our impact as an institution. Tonight, we welcome another internationally renowned architect whose contribution will add richness and dimensionality to a new chapter in the story of RIT. Please join me in a warm, in-person Vignelli Center welcome for Michael Maltzan.
The in-person part is one of the most startling things. It is very nice to see you all, to see people in general. Thank you, Josh, for that terrific introduction. I spent time at had the opportunity to spend time at the Vignelli Center over the course of the day, and it's another one of those moments where you realize how many special, extraordinary things take place and happen on the RIT campus. I have known about the Vignellis since I was a very young designer. To actually see their archive in person and to see the scale of their endeavors is somewhat humbling, but is just an amazing resource that I hope more and more people get to know and should know. I want to echo Josh's appreciation also for all of the work that President Munson, Dr. Gramberg, Dr. Waters continue to do to promote architecture's role on the campus. And we've also been fortunate to work with a terrific team on the building we're working on here, John Moore, Jim Yarrington, Ted, Torrey, and our partner in Rochester, Mike Madalena. I named the lecture tonight Interdiscipline. It's a very present topic in many design endeavors today. I think it's a pressing topic in a lot of institutions and in culture today. How we think about access, hierarchies, equity, transparency, inclusion, and just working across a lot of the more siloized and traditional boundaries of specialization is a part of a significant generational change that's taking place, and one that I think we have to be aware of as designers and architects. Architecture has always represented culture as it has continued to evolve, and how it renegotiates spaces, forms, connections, and relationships in the world is fundamental to architecture's task, and I think never more than today, given many of the challenges that we have in front of us. I want to talk about a series of projects that we have worked on over the last probably 10 years that, for me, start to relate to this topic, not in one way, but in a number of different ways that I hope becomes clear after I'm done at the end of the lecture. We designed and constructed a building on the Rice University campus in Houston a number of years ago called the Moody Center. It is a interdisciplinary arts building, fundamentally. It's not connected to any one department. It is really across, or works across the different departments at the school, and also is a building and a program and a center that's meant to connect Rice to the community in Houston, the community in Texas, and really nationally and internationally. When Rice was founded, it had three pieces of its original mandate. On its seal, it talks about science, letters, and art. And science and letters have been a big part of Rice's personality and identity as an institution over the years, but the arts have been, while present, not as forcefully connected to Rice's identity, its ability to connect students, faculty, and makers, as I mentioned, nationally and internationally. Their goal with the Moody Center was to take an interdisciplinary approach to the arts, to start to connect the ability for a curated arts program to take place and to bring in other disciplines as partners in an ongoing series of programs, exhibitions, and pedagogical ambitions. There was no real precedent for this building on campus, but as I began to think about the building, one of the things that occurred to me is that, in a way, what we were talking about in the program, by putting so many different pieces of separate, normally separated programs together, was that, in a way, we were creating a campus in and of itself, in the building itself. Rice's campus is made of a series of generally long linear buildings with green spaces in between. Those green spaces are very much where the connections get made. They happen in the spaces in between the science building, the engineering building, the English faculty building. And the idea for the building was almost to take that campus and all of those buildings and start to, this is not an architectural term, but to start to smush them together and try to find a way to put those disciplines and those spaces together so that you were creating both the specialization, or the ability to support the specializations, but also to be able to create the impromptu spaces that are so important in this kind of ambition. The building is extremely transparent, very open at the ground level, really at the campus level. It almost feels like the campus flows in and through the building. And many of the exhibition spaces, many of the public programs are on that ground floor, with the ambition that it feels like they are connected to the campus in a very intrinsic way. Above that is floating the series of longer brick forms that house more of the classroom-like spaces, or spaces that don't need as much light or can't have quite as much access. The brick is a similar brick that's used throughout the Rice campus in its proportion and in the way that it is it is constructed, but the color was changed to a magnesium oxide brick that has an incredible quality where it changes over the course of the day. Sometimes the brick seems almost black, sometimes it has a kind of silvery color, sometimes it seems blue, and that variability seemed to speak to the dynamic that was taking place or would take place inside the building. There are many, as I mentioned, different types of spaces, everything from a black box theater, 99-seat black box theater, true analog shops. There's metal shops and wood shops, sewing shops, as well as more flexible spaces where the center can either use those spaces as classroom spaces, as studio spaces, or when I was there recently, as additional exhibition spaces. Many of the connections, the vertical connections, are not just pragmatic stairs, but they're places that start to become things like small amphitheaters. You can have impromptu classes there. There's much that's programmed inside the Moody, but one of the things that I think architecture can take on, or at least begin to anticipate, is the unprogrammed, that the buildings can start to become a kind of armature for activity, both inside and outside. And while there are while there are galleries like the permanent gallery that's a cross program with the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, there are many other moments where artists have begun to take over parts of the building from the exterior so that it has a liveliness on the outside as well. We recently completed a project at MIT for the new Vassar Street Residence Hall dormitory, which is 420 beds. It's a very long, thin building. And in many ways, it's located at a threshold that is increasingly taking hold on the campus between the traditional campus center, in this case, the playing fields, the traditional row of residential buildings along the Charles River, including Alvarado's Baker Hall, which is a very beautiful building. Along this edge, there are train tracks that are used by the transit line and are still in operation, but are slowly being migrated, will eventually in about 10 years become public space and bike trails. And then in this direction, an older neighborhood of factory buildings in Kendall Square that has rapidly become the center of enormous biotech innovation and work. Many laboratories are taking place there. And really thought about the building as this threshold between the interior life of the MIT campus in a traditional way and its inevitable expansion into these other parts of the city where they're partnering with a lot of these laboratories. From the playing fields, the building is organized in what appears to be a series of almost separate, they would call them house clusters. And it's the way that residential life is organized at MIT. There are smaller cluster pods that really look after each other. In a sense, they're the family for a student. And then interspersed in between are courtyards, very similar to the buildings typologically that are just across the playing field and historically have been the type of housing at MIT. But they're connected by this long spine that fronts the railroad tracks and Kendall Square. The idea for this building came from a rethinking of the way residential life at MIT was starting to evolve. The buildings that they have begun to be, they've begun to build for residential life are not just dormitories, but they're dormitories that are chock full of all sorts of other types of activities that include things like music rooms, workout rooms, there's a yoga room, there's maker spaces and 3D printers in the building. As opposed to grouping them all in a separate wing, instead we started to distribute them vertically with the idea that you would move, as you move through the building, you would connect to those spaces at the ground level, but also as you started to percolate up or percolate down to your rooms. And that way, you're spreading these collective spaces, these interdisciplinary spaces through residential life, trying to connect that academic life more with the residential, the mandate of the building. The ground floor, again, is extremely transparent. There's a large, the large eating hall is right on the street. A number of those other spaces like yoga, meeting rooms are also on the street. This is the entry courtyard. You come in under a planar brick wall. Here we constructed all of the facades out of a very thin brick that was panelized. And the reason for that is that this building was meant to achieve very, very high sustainability standards. And by creating a panelized brick system, we were able to test all the panels in the shop before they got brought out to the building for any kind of air infiltration, any kind of leaking, so that we could establish that they were, the panels, the exterior skin was hitting the sustainability criteria. The building is 3 colors. There's a white background. Then there's a kind of brownish reddish brick, which relates to a building adjacent to it, an old but monumental storage building that's an icon in that part of the city. And then it's a little bit harder to see, but in this entry courtyard, there's a blue brick which shows up as an accent that weaves through the building and connects many of those social or more public spaces, in a sense coding the way that you move through the building. You begin to see it a bit here. It looks a little gray in the image, but it's actually quite bright blue in the daylight. Those spaces on the interior, as I mentioned, are a real mix. Student lounge, there's a music room immediately off of that. There's the mail room and entry is down below. The laundry room is something that's not hidden away in the basement, but it's a part of the way that you move through the building because everybody does laundry, and that's a great space where people run into each other. And then the eating hall that looks out on the street and really connects the life inside the building to the street. I mentioned that large brick building and another one of the post-industrial buildings next to it, the one of the smokestacks. At the back of the building, while it is that long white brick form, it's interspersed with an almost graphic patterning that starts to at least allude to the shapes and the sculptural quality of the industrial landscape of Kendall Square that it relates to. And as this trainway, this right-of-way, starts to get turned back into more public space, this becomes as much the front facade of the building as the entry courtyard off of Vassar Street. We recently finished, so recently, that because of COVID, I have not actually seen this building completely done yet, which is a little devastating as an architect, but fortunately I'm getting to go to Canada in about a month to see it. It's a project for the Winnipeg Art Gallery for their new Inuit Arts Center named Kaumayuk. It's a extremely important building socially, culturally in Winnipeg. Winnipeg has had a long relationship with Indigenous communities, especially Inuit communities, who have both lived, Indigenous communities that have lived in and around Winnipeg, but also the connection up to Hudson's Bay and the Inuit communities that live around the bay. And there is this incredible culture of art making in those communities. the Inuit Art Center in the Winnipeg Art Gallery has the largest collection of contemporary Inuit art in the world, which makes this really the largest public collection of Inuit art in the world, certainly in contemporary terms. The existing building is a building from the late 1960s, early 1970s, by an architect, Gus DeRosa, Canadian architect, strong modernist who practiced and taught in Winnipeg. The building is a very beautiful triangular-shaped modernist monolith, quite opaque from the outside, but very dynamic in its shaping. Our building is on the third smallest leg of that triangle, which was mostly back of house at one point. I thought about the building as, the new building is really, I was describing it as an object which completed another object. And what I meant by that was that both the new building, as well as obviously the existing DeRosa building, needed to maintain their individual identity, their individual ability to communicate something about the moment in which they were made, but they also had to be great partners working together to create a more cohesive building. So our new building has this more fluid, scalloped exterior facade made out of a white Bethel granite, but as it starts to turn around the edges, it aligns with the triangular shape of the DeRosa building, making it feel as if their geometries were very much in partnership. One of the challenges that the Inuit Art Center had was that, like many museums or archives, over 95% of their collection is always in storage, which means a very small tip of the iceberg is actually ever visible. And one of the goals for the Winnipeg Art Gallery was to increase the visibility of that collection, but also increase the accessibility for individuals to see that collection without necessarily having to even enter the galleries or to pay admissions to go in and see the collections. The front entry of the building is this voluminous, very tall lobby space, especially at night, incredibly lit like a lantern out to the surrounding city neighborhood and city fabric. And at the very center is a curvilinear glass structure called the Visible Vault, where the majority of the collection of smaller stone carvings, and that makes up at least the most traditional part of this contemporary collection, is visible. Because they're made out of stone, we don't have the same kind of conservation concerns as you might, for instance, with works on paper or textiles. So this vault is multi-storied. It's 3 stories within the lobby, plus a floor below it into the whole basement area where there's a study center. You will, as somebody walking by on the street or coming into the lobby, you're able to access visibly, you're able to come right up to the majority of that part of the collection and have a very intimate and very personal relationship with it. But there's also work going on inside of the vault. The conservators, the curators are always working in that space, up and down. So you get to also see the beehive of activity that takes place, the constant activity that goes into supporting the work that you often just see in the gallery on exhibition. As you come in, the movement up to the gallery is up and around, spiraling really around the visible vault. Just adjacent to that, the stairs up to the galleries move through a glass wall and become an auditorium called the Learning Steps, which is a multi-purpose lecture hall that can be curtained off if it needs to have privacy or be darkened for lectures. But often the talks that are going on about the collection to visitors are happening right adjacent to the collection itself in that space. When I went to the Arctic Circle to visit the artists and to see their studios, one of the things that really struck me was that there is this incredible vastness to that landscape. It's profound. It's really one of the most moving experiences that I've had as an architect, beyond architect, as a person. What was even more remarkable was to see that the majority of the artists were working and carving outside their houses, outside their studios, in that landscape. In a way, this landscape was their studio. And one of the questions I had was, how do you start to make spaces that relate to the place where the art was made? I think that sense of that landscape it wasn't something that I was trying to mimic. I don't think you can mimic that kind of extraordinary landscape, but potentially you can start to infer some of the qualities of that place, either through its fluidness. The primary gallery is not a rectangular, a traditional rectangular gallery, but is a more fluid shape in plan and in elevation. Extremely light-filled, with a kind of diffused light that can be controlled, not dissimilar to the dome of light that you see in the north. And to have a size and a scale that starts to at least approximate the space where the art is made, the kind of outdoor space that surrounds the art and the artists when they're in fact making the work. Landscape has been something that, while outside of the typical purview of architects, of course, is something that I've been fascinated in for a long time because of its publicness, because of its role in starting to create and make public space, and the relationships that can be made by landscape between buildings, between communities, and the city that surrounds it. We began working with the developers Tisch and Speyer a number of years ago in an area called Playa Vista. In one of the last large tracts of land that you would find in the city, it was formerly the Hughes aircraft site. In fact, this line approximates one of the main runways that Hughes aircraft used. It was a site that had, because it was a manufacturing site, had some number of soil remediation issues. It's close to wetlands. We were originally asked to do 2 buildings at this gateway, but then the buildings were on a very slow track of development. And in the meantime, Tisch and Speyer asked us to design the landscape. We knew that there would be buildings all around this park. There were already some buildings built here, and the way I started to think about the park was not so much a park that you would look at, but a park that had genuine activities. It was a kind of 24-hour park. People, this is an area that has become known as Silicon Beach. It's a very creative area of the city with many businesses that are tech centered, starting to build buildings and rent space in the area. That's a type of activity that often goes beyond a normal 8-hour day, and the people who are working here spend significant amounts of time certainly at their job, and I was trying to find ways for these outdoor spaces to start to become extensions of their lives as individuals, as small communities, and also as large communities. What I mean by that is I thought of the park first and foremost as a series of bridges that would connect the 2 sides of the development, to link them together. Secondly, there are a series of water elements that are in between these bridges that were part of the remediation program, in the way that the water, the groundwater would be pumped up and through the bridges as a series of filters. There are a number of different types of activities, everything from horticultural gardens where you can take horticultural classes. There's the shady bridge that has bocce and horseshoes in it. There's a basketball court, beach volleyball, children's playground. There's a very large amphitheater where there are community events and gatherings. The band shell and that amphitheater is really the center of the park. It's a fabric structure with that's wrapped around a very animated cage or frame that seems to be supported, in fact is supported, just at its edges. It's almost like a clamshell that's opened up to create a proscenium out for the performers to the amphitheater. And at night can light up and can, of course, change color. But becomes really the beacon or the lantern, the meeting point at the center of this larger emerging campus. We finally did do the buildings a couple of years later at the corner. There are two buildings, one a quite long building in an L-shaped, and then a stacked building at the center of that. The idea for these buildings first was to allow the park to start to come in and intertwine with the buildings. I thought of the new building almost as a kind of catcher's mitt for the activity of the park and the park itself. There isn't underground parking in the building. The park space is burned down. All the parking is under the building, semi-submerged but open air. And then there are a series of bridges that connect the building out to the road and the sidewalks. I had mentioned that this area has really become, people call it Silicon Beach. A number of tech companies and schools have moved in. Loyola Marymount has moved their tech incubator here. Facebook has been a major tenant. Google is just adjacent to the area. So here you can begin to see the idea of the park moving in, through, and around the buildings. The buildings, in a sense, sit in this in-between of anchoring the street, but also being a part of the landscape. There's a piece of a parking deck which runs through the building that can be cross-programmed. Sometimes it's parking, sometimes it's for corporate events and celebrations, so that the parking is doing really double duty. And then you can see in these images the landscape bridges as they come up to the buildings, so that they're tethered to the landscape through these small botanical bridges. This is a photograph right after it was done, so there's no cars here, but this gives you a sense of how the building sits above that landscape that's semi-submerged. One of the things that I was very interested in was not just the shaping of the glass and the size of the windows and the breathing, it seems almost of the shaping of the windows, but the coloration of the glass itself. That has a silver tint to it and really starts to reflect either the plants, the landscape, the gardens, or the sky. And so as you move around the building, the windows start to shimmer with reflections of the context and the environment around you. We've been working for a number of years now, since the mid-2000s. A significant part of our work is around the question of housing and affordability in cities. I think it's fair to say that housing and affordability in housing, questions around especially homelessness, has become one of the central crises in most cities. And in a city like Los Angeles, I think it's also fair to say that it's probably the most existential crisis for the future of the city. We began working with a group, Skid Row Housing Trust, whose mandate is around housing formerly homeless individuals and giving them a permanent and supportive place to live. And we've done 4 of these projects. The third of the project, Star Apartments, is probably the most ambitious of the projects. This is all Skid Row, and this, of course, is downtown. And while you can see that there's this incredible proximity between the two, they're like two worlds apart. Star Apartments, it's 104 units. As I mentioned, it's permanent supportive housing. And when we first got involved with the Housing Trust, they were just beginning to start to work with that model of providing housing. Our first project with them, Rainbow Apartments, was their first permanent supportive project. And what that means is that, exactly what it says, you can, if you're a resident here, you can live here for the most part for the rest of your life. It is permanent housing. This is your home. That has the ability to start producing community as opposed to the shelter-based model where people were just constantly shuttling through and never were able to start to build any true community connections. Second part is just as important, that these buildings have supportive services in the building, people's doctors, caseworkers, vocational training. In the past model, you had to go out and try to find all of those individual services, and very often for people who were susceptible or a bit fragile in their situation, being back out on the street created significant recidivism, and very often those individuals found themselves back out on the street. The supportive part is really the piece that created a necessity for a new way of thinking about these buildings to find a way to integrate these other supportive and community functions. In this project, though, while that was the main driver, there were other important things that the Trust was trying to do. This is their first mixed-use project, and also their first project where they're really reusing an existing building that wasn't a hotel or another residential building. It was this building, which was a retail building, 1 story tall, exactly the kind of building in Los Angeles that you would have normally scraped off the site and started completely anew. But that's a problematic and I think untenable solution if you start to think about the sustainability concerns in the city. We have to find ways of using even maybe our less glamorous buildings, our less historic buildings, as foundations for the buildings that we can then add to or create on top of them as a way of using and reusing what we've made already. We did strip the skin off of it because that was had largely outlived its purpose, and that became the new base of the building. And then we needled down through the building, creating this new layer of public or community program, created a new concrete tray above that, and then built all of the residential units on top of that tray. So it's a real sandwich. At that mid-level, the community spaces, it's an incredible amalgam. It's almost a small city in and of itself. It's everything from community kitchen, large community gardens, area right outside of the kitchen, outdoor eating area shaded by the building up above, art classroom, recreation room, vocational training spaces, supportive services. There's a half-court basketball, pickleball court, and then a jogging, walking track around the entire perimeter. The other aspect of this project that was really a goal and an ambition was to try to create as much density as possible. That also might not be such an unusual idea in a city like Tokyo, for instance. But in Los Angeles, density is a completely new phenomena, even though it's something that is very much a part of our future. Here, I was trying to create almost a small quarter block where there's housing, of course, around the perimeter, but there's even housing on the inside to start to explore just how much housing we could actually get on that site using this in-between horizontal space as the open space for the community. The third piece of this was using prefabrication to build all of the units, or to create all of the units. This is the first multifamily prefabricated residential building in Los Angeles. I won't get into it, but for some very specific reasons, you weren't allowed to, you weren't able to do multifamily prefabrication in Los Angeles from a code standpoint. So before we even started the project as architects, our first job was working with the city of LA and the permitting department to find a pathway for prefabrication to not just take place in this building, but to also start to create a pathway for prefabrication to take place in the city afterwards. Because there isn't any prefabrication, or there wasn't any prefabrication in the city, all of the units were built in Boise, Idaho, where Gurdon Enterprises, a prefabricated manufacturer, is located. It was an incredible project and a very different way of thinking about buildings as an architect, because while we're used to being involved throughout the entire project as it's being built, and in construction you're answering questions, and you're on the site with the contractor and the client. In prefabrication, once you've gone to the factory, and that happened twice, and eventually signed off on the mock-up, you're done. In fact, there's nothing you can do. It goes into production. You would have to hit the red button to stop the assembly line, which is impossible. And then all of the units eventually start to come out to the site. And what was amazing was that when they actually started to arrive on site, from the moment the first unit went onto the tray, it was 3 weeks. And all of the units, all 104 units were placed, which was really the benefit, I think, more than anything, of this kind of a strategy, is not so much in the construction cost, but in the speed in which you can build these units. And also, from a sustainability standpoint, there's very little construction waste, because you're using everything, you're doing everything in the factory in a pre-engineered way. That goal around housing has certainly, as I mentioned, been a big part of our work, and has continued to expand. It's a project that we finished a number of years ago called One Santa Fe, which is 80% market rate, 20% affordable project in an area known as the Arts District, also right outside of the edge of downtown Los Angeles, along the LA River, and bordered on one edge by the First Street Bridge, which is one of the bridges that connects east and west. This is a project that in many ways starts to blur, because of its scale, the relationship between building and urban design, I mean, the image is a little bit of a joke, I understand, but I think that it's trying to get across this point that scale and its effect on the city can happen in many, many different ways. Most people would imagine that buildings like these are the things that create identity and urbanism and the center of an urban place or a city. But in fact, it's, I think, more the way that you think about urbanism in relationship to its context that allows architecture to have the ability to be both architecture and building, but also urban design at the same time. This is one of the images that I probably like the most, because in this image you start to see the building as, in some ways you can look at it as certainly an individual building, a significant building in the city, but in other ways it starts to meld into the foreground and the background, which is a way, just through the texture and the siting and the scale, that it starts to become a more integral part of the city scene. But it also works at a programmatic level. The building is a layered stack of program. The ground floor is around 80,000 square feet of mixed-use commercial. And then on the northern portion, because we couldn't build underground, there are 2 stories of parking that are built in a way, designed in a way that eventually, as the car starts to recede more and more from the city, which we're already starting to see, that that parking garage can be turned back into housing, which is also a real exploration of ours. And then 3 and 5 stories of housing on top of that. It's a kind of Neapolitan sandwich. Both within that long scale of the building, there are 430 units of housing at many different scales. But where it hits the ground, it starts to, the building starts to be punctuated by different moments and elements that work to connect to the context around it. Things as simple as the ramp up to the parking, which ends 2nd Street, or this large bridge, which provides a gateway into this center space of the building, which also has this multi-use parking area that gets used for festivals. In the Arts District, it's used for festivals in the building, but is also anticipating a new transit stop behind the building, which is meant to be built in the next couple of years, which means that between the station and the Arts District, the building starts to become the gateway between the rest of the city and the Arts District itself. I mentioned the number of units in the building. There are lots of ways of creating affordability, I think, in housing. It can be in the way that you build the buildings, it can be in the way that you finance the buildings. But one of the things, because of the scale at One Santa Fe, that we tried to do was to create the greatest diversity in unit types, everything from small micro studios, small 1-bedrooms, then more traditional 2-bedroom units, all the way up to 4-bedroom units, with the idea that, for instance, a 4-bedroom unit could be, could have 8 people, young people starting their careers in the downtown area that could share that apartment in a kind of co-living situation, or you could get a small micro studio for yourself. And it's that range that starts to create a number of different ways in which somebody can live in this building and tailor their own life and their own economic abilities, but still be able to live in the city, as opposed to having to move to farther and farther flung districts, which puts more and more pressure on them being able to get to their work or see their friends. In the beginning of the project, we worked with a number of groups, both nonprofit but also groups within the city, to anticipate what eventually might be connections between the Arts District, One Santa Fe, and the way in which the river, which has up until recently been thought of as mostly a storm water piece of infrastructure. It's run by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's more being seen as an amenity in the city, and actually as a real river, and is slowly being restored, and more housing and more communities are moving in and around the buildings. The goal was to eventually span the tracks. It wouldn't happen in exactly this way, but to span the tracks to create a connection across the tracks to the river, knitting together the district with this new amenity. And I've noticed in many cities, and even here in Rochester, that infrastructure, especially post-war infrastructure, things like highways, have been rethought, and our connections between different districts across the elements in cities that have divided us and torn the city apart is becoming more and more a reality. And I think this is a real role for architects to begin to project possibility into their projects beyond the project that you may, the specifics of the project that you're working on at hand. I want to talk about two more projects. One Santa Fe is really in many ways at the scale of infrastructure, but it is still a building. We a number of years ago were part of a team that won a competition, an international competition, to replace the existing 6th Street Viaduct in Los Angeles, very near, in fact, next to One Santa Fe, the building I just talked about. The viaduct is almost a mile long. Its crossing of the LA River is one of the smallest parts of the engineering and design exercise. But it spans across what was a floodplain of the Los Angeles River before it was channelized. The bridge, it was incredibly iconic. In fact, it was in almost every, if you go back and you look at old car commercials, you've probably seen the bridge. If you watch any post-apocalyptic Hollywood movie from 10 or 15 years ago, you've probably seen that bridge. It really stood in for the city, and it was this beloved icon in the city. The bridge had to be taken down for safety reasons, having to do with a deficit in the concrete that had just magnified over years and years and years. And the goal of the new viaduct through the competition was to recreate that connection, but also establish a new icon for the city to replace that original icon. That was a difficult task in a lot of ways to imagine in the beginning. One of the ways that at least I tried to approach that idea as the bridge architect was to take those original two pairs of arches that everybody knew and celebrate not just the crossing of the river, but actually the knitting together of these different districts in the city, to say that infrastructure wasn't something that necessarily had to divide us in cities, but was in fact something that could connect us if it was rethought to take on multiple roles, to move from a kind of monoculture of use to a multiculture of purpose and use. There are many things it crosses. The river, there are high power lines, there's 4 individual railroad lines that run through a series of utilities. There's 2 highways it crosses over. So it's really spanning a number of these different separations. For me, the idea was really that you could start to rethink infrastructure in a city that is known for its infrastructure, certainly known for its highways, by thinking about how it can take on the responsibility and the role of creating true connection. The bridge is, of course, for vehicles. There's bicycle access. There are bike ramps that connect a lower park area, which incidentally is being developed by our partners on the project, Hargraves Jones, who is also working on the RIT campus. So we always seem to be in close proximity to each other, working on these projects. But then also a series of stairs that lead up from that lower area, the flats area, the park, connecting or using the bridge as a bridge that doesn't just connect from one side to another, but also starts to connect vertically, knitting the city together in a true three-dimensional way. The idea of an icon, as I mentioned, was a bit daunting. This idea that you could create an icon from day one was something that made me quite anxious, a little bit nervous. I was starting to think about other icons in cities, like the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, or the St. Louis Arch, the Eiffel Tower. All of these are icons in cities that you look at and establish a kind of iconic presence, singular presence. They can certainly, they're images that are on postcards, and you know instantaneously the city that you're in. But as I thought about all of those different structures more, the thing that I realized was that while they are they have those iconic images, each and every one of them is actually an observatory. They're a place you go to and you go up in or into and you look back out to the city. They are places that allow you to rethink, re-see, and reestablish, maybe even question the city that you think you know so well. And one of the things I'm most excited about the 6th Street Viaduct is that in many ways, because of its position, its length, the multiple vantage points, the way you can climb all over the bridge, what it connects to, that it also acts as a kind of observatory, maybe a less formal observatory, but an observatory nonetheless that really allows you to be both within the city, participating in the city, but in a sense to step back and to see the city more objectively. The bridge is going to certainly be lit up. The torch will cross it in 2028 for the Olympics. It's even further along than this. The bridge itself will be finished in this summer, middle to the end of the summer, and Hargraves Jones Parks will start right at that point and be finished about a year and a half after that. We are, of course, working on a project here at RIT, which is getting more and more exciting and closer to starting construction every day. It's really terrific to be back on campus again and to be able to walk around campus and happily be also or continue to be convinced that the building that we're all doing together, the new music theater, is I think going to be an extremely dynamic part of the RIT community. It's very exciting to see. We started the project really at the beginning by going back and looking at the campus as it was initially formed. This is one of the things that whenever I get the chance to tell anybody about RIT, I always start talking about that. It's an incredibly rare thing to have a campus that was a cohesive concept that started from a genuine approach and a set of values about the school to make something new that represented the future of the institution, not only its past. The buildings are quite phenomenal, post-war buildings. They have an incredible strength. They have one of the most diverse palettes of brickwork and detailing that I know of. There's something to genuinely be celebrated because you have something that very few other campuses, very few other cities internationally have with the same level of quality and purpose. Of course, that campus has grown significantly from the original campus with just a few connections to a campus which has many different activities, disciplines, communities that are a part of it, and it has just expanded in scale with a number of additional ways in which you move through, around, and connect on the campus. The new music theater is here with the central entry loop road just off of that. There, at the time we were looking at, or we were starting to talk about this project, there were really three significant sites that were under study for other projects. The shed, which is in construction, potentially new work at the athletic fields. And it seemed to us that there were these new gateways or new entry points, these new nodes that had another kind of logic within that larger historic logic of the campus. Because of that location, and that the possibility of making a new gateway between the interior part of the existing campus and the public frontage of the ring road, the shape of the building, the sculptural presence of the new music theater was something that we looked at intensively, trying to create a form that had a strong sculptural identity in and of itself, but also one that started to relate to some of the strength and scale of the sculptural presence of the existing buildings, and also a building that started to feel almost like it was in motion, turning between the inside of the campus and the entry. From the front, the building really presents a strong facade. It's a very tall building because of the theater inside of it, with a arrivals plaza or courtyard that you come up slightly to, echoing in some ways some of the ways that you come up and across and into the campus with those bridge-like thresholds in a number of the buildings or areas of the campus. Very transparent lobby that creates a welcoming sense of the activity on the inside of the building, welcoming sense of the lobby and public space right off of that courtyard. And then a building that is punctuated on this side with a series of quite large and then smaller vignette windows, which from the exterior give you glimpses into the upper levels of the balcony lobbies up in the higher parts of the building. So you'll see people up in the building through those picture windows. You'll see color and light through those windows, but it's also a place that if you're going in or out of the theater and you're on those balcony lobbies, that you get to see back out to the campus. So there's this real dialogue between the inside and the outside of the building, between arriving and entering, being in the building and being able to see back out from where you just came. On the other side, the campus side, access across. This is Main Road, which connects parking up into the campus. And you can see that the building also has this quite sculptural presence back to the inner part of the campus, but is also punctuated by some important elements of the building, including an amphitheater right at the corner, which allows for informal or impromptu activities to take place. It certainly can be programmed as well, but it's a way in which the building starts to communicate its purpose without you necessarily having to go into the building, but becomes a kind of armature or platform to allow for different performances, different types of communications to take place. For a student to talk about, or a group of students to talk about concerns about their world to their fellow students. On the back of the building, a number of the back of house spaces, scene shop, costume shop, making spaces on the inside of the theater are transparent glass and have visibility both from inside out, but outside into the building, so that as you're walking around the building, the activity inside, the making of sets, the making of costumes are things that are part of the life of the campus. They're part of the pedagogical culture of the campus, and they will be visible to anybody walking around the building. So it's not a building that is completely hiding its activities. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's a building that attempts to broadcast the activity that's important to the activities in the music theater out to, in a very generous way, the campus as a whole. Certainly at night, the building is able to light up as a kind of beacon, again, a beehive of activity that you'll see at that ground level, whether it's those making spaces, the production spaces, a rehearsal space, which can act also as a small chamber hall, the lobby immediately off of that corner. As you move up through the building, the large public stairs is also very visible as a kind of lantern or beacon, a marker in the campus. And the building is meant to be projected on, so that the building is also an animated armature of activity, of the ability to use technology to expand the role of the arts and music and performance in very public ways around the campus. The building is, we're looking at the cladding of the building being a kind of fluted or almost a corduroy texture, large in scale, which comes from some of the geometric historic art that I've seen on the campus, whether it's the brick murals in the library space or the way that the Albers paintings in the main lobby of the main hall start to create this sense of movement and a kind of intense optical or visual quality to the surfaces of the buildings around the campus. And here I think this corduroy texture has the ability to do the same thing, especially as light and shade and shadow over the course of the day start to track across that very animated sculptural facade. You get a little bit of a sense of the scale of those flutes at the lower portion of the building, but this is where the amphitheater comes across and creates almost a portal that allows you to in a sense, cut the corner of the building, connecting two pedestrian ways, which is also something that happens quite a bit at RIT. There are a number of moments in buildings where you're able to, the buildings are very generous in the way that they cut out corners, open themselves up to allow for a pedestrian group of people to circumnavigate the building. So you're both in the building and outside at the same time. You're seeing immediately adjacent that rehearsal and small recital space. The lobby of the entry lobby of the hall is a double height space filled with light, series of skylights that have more animated and geometric textures or geometries within the ceiling of the lobby, almost as if they've been incised or cut into the ceiling. Views out to that entry plaza, the campus beyond. Columns have a series of light fixtures, so the columns become almost like chandeliers. The idea here that the lighting, the decorative lighting, and the structures start to tie together. And then large grand stair, which starts to lead you up to the theater with mezzanine inside the lobby, which can also act as a space to hang out and watch people coming in to the lobby. It becomes a kind of people-watching perch. Color has been a significant part of my work over the years. I use color in many different ways. I like to think of my use of color almost as a type of material. But in this building, it's really an orientation. It's as much a kind of orientation device as anything, that the different different spaces are color-coded. So as you move around the building, there's this palette of materials or palette of colors that start to create different impressions and different hues to the spaces inside the building, but also because of the transparency project out to the campus around it. These are a few views of the inside of the spaces, the grand stair leading up, public stair leading up, one of the balcony lobbies, which is quite tall with views through those large windows back out to the campus. Even the back of house spaces start to have this strong color keyboard as a part of its quality. The inside of the hall is meant to be a space that both communicates a great presence for some of the important elements inside the hall, the balconies, the organ lofts on either side of the proscenium, but also to be a space that has a sense of the ability to make things in it, to continue to evolve and change what happens on the inside of the theater. In a sense, it's a combination of a more traditional, almost opera-style hall and a black box together. The exterior of the hall being these different shades of gray and black, that then a wood treatment starts to wrap the organ, the balconies, to create sculptural elements that start to feel like they're floating, almost like characters on the inside of the theater. One of the other things that we're doing is taking the catwalks and creating on the hangers a series of these textured, color-textured rods in different silvers and a kind of brass color, which, when the lights are on, will take something very pragmatic like the lighting catwalks and turn them into a kind of chandelier in and of itself that will have a slight shimmering quality. And it's interesting being at the Vignelli Center and seeing the Bertoia sculptures, that how related for me this idea is to those early sculptures, which are part of the collection here at RIT. And I want to finish with this image because I think it really captures the spirit of the hall and maybe the important part of what I think this hall has the ability to mean to the community here at RIT. The hall is certainly a place for learning across many disciplines. This is a type of program which will take the abilities of much of what happens in the different departments at RIT and bring them together to clearly create an extraordinarily dynamic and very forward-leaning set of programs and performances. It's a place where the culture of performance and performing scholars that are here at RIT can call their home a place where that idea about performance and the arts at RIT will have a very strong and visual space and public presence in which to continue to grow those programs and project out to the world the phenomenal work that's going on in those disciplines at RIT. But I also think this is fundamentally a place where community can come together. Community within the college itself, community between RIT and the larger Rochester and Upper New York region. But this is clearly also going to be a space based on its quality, its scale, its size, and the other things going on at RIT that will be an attraction to different performers and groups nationally and internationally, making the music theater, I think, a true location and of phenomenal conversation, communication between RIT and its broad constituencies, and a place where over RIT's future, that those series of connections can continue to be cemented, celebrated, and further grown to be an even greater part of the identity and the future of the Institute. Again, I want to thank everybody for inviting me, Josh, the Vignelli Center, for inviting me today, and the leadership at RIT for allowing us to continue to work on what is one of the most exciting projects we're working on, and that I've worked on personally. Thank you very much.
We'd like to take some time for questions, and the way we'll handle this is a question from the live audience and then one from the Zoom audience. So if there are any questions from the live audience, we can start with you. Mike. Oh, that's right. Sorry.
I'll save the questions for the RIT project because that's so exciting. My question goes back to the very beginning when you were showing the Boston slide, MIT, and you showed that railroad track, and you said that eventually, 10 years, I think you said, that will become pedestrian. Did you design for the future to think that way, that that'll be a pretty cool area where you'll see a lot of people?
We did. I didn't. One of the things I didn't show about the MIT project is along that entire length of tracks are a series of bicycle garages, if you will, that MIT has a very strong advocacy around bicycle transportation on the campus. And so that entire back is really the place where if you're arriving from with a bicycle, which is what that pedestrian bicycle corridor on the railroad tracks will be centered around, that becomes your front entry into the building. The lobby of the building already in the design goes all the way through, really punctuates all the way through from Vassar Street, which is the traditional street front and sidewalk entry to the building. You can walk right through the lobby and you're on the other side, you're on the track side right now. The idea is that in a way the building will have two different facades, one facing both directions, when that area starts to become truly public space or becomes that bicycle and pedestrian pathway and park in the future. And I think that's one of the ways that buildings begin. They have to be able to anticipate what that future is potentially going to be like, what the uses are going to continue, how the uses are going to continue to evolve, how the buildings connect to the public realm and city space. I think the building is, in a sense, really not complete right now. It's not operating at its fullest potential until that happens, because it was designed with the anticipation that people would be coming from that direction as well. So, in a way, we have to come back in 10 years and see if the building's really a success.
All right. I'm told we only have time for one more question. I'm sorry to say.
This is the problem with not lecturing in a long time in public. I want to talk for 5 hours.
Well, I am going to go to one of our online questions, and while we have quite a number of them, I'm going to give you one that might provide some context for a student population. And that's a common one that I've heard before, which is, can you describe a day in the life of your design firm?
I think one of the things that marks a firm like mine which is very much a studio-based office, is that on the one hand, there's a very steady and constant pace to the feeling of the office, which has to do with the process being very much an iterative process on all of the projects, that we keep evolving the projects as we move along. And that sets up a real cadence to the work. We are an office that I think is completely committed to trying things, being willing to fail, starting again, and continuing that process until you find the solution that feels like it's the most appropriate, most right solution for a particular project. At the same time, because we're making things physically in the office, it's a very model-intensive office. We make a lot of full-scale mock-ups. There's a constant activity that you might expect in, for instance, if you walk into a shop, a wood shop or a metal shop, which I think brings a liveliness to the work. And that also creates a different rhythm, a kind of immediacy to the design work and the design sessions that bring a great deal of vitality and life to the day in, day out process. We use those models as the design does not happen in isolation. I don't work in a separate room someplace. The other people in the office, it's a very open office. We work around the models. They become almost the campfire of activity that we're all collected around. And much of the design is a genuine debate and conversation. And every time a new thing gets made, a new model gets made, a new iteration gets made, that energizes that debate. It energizes that conversation. So I like to think of the office maybe having two very different sine curves or sine waves of activity. One that is quite consistent and methodical and is running the marathon, and the other which is really forceful, punctuated, and highlighted by these moments of real questioning, debate, and recalibration.
Thank you for that. That's both revealing and I think reflective of the excellent work that comes from your office. So thank you once again, Michael, and thanks everyone for coming both in person and online, and look out for messaging for our next lecture.
Thank you.
Thanks.